Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
There is a fair bit of resistance to humour in a business context because people think, that's what I do out of business. But it all comes down to our evolutions. Our brains have evolved. Our brains are hardwired to separate everyone we meet into them and us. And so we separate everyone we meet and we decide this very quickly, whether that person is a them or that person is an us. And that all comes down to about 10, 20,000 years ago when our brains evolved, our tribes maxed out at about 200 people.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe. And with that, let's meet today's guest.
Hi, I'm Marty Wilson. I am a former Australian Comic of the Year, now a business speaker who helps people how to use humour in sales. I help people how to establish rapport incredibly quickly so we can get to that know, like, and trust as quickly as possible.
On this episode of the show, with the legend and hilarious Marty, we're diving into how we can use humour to build know, like, and trust with both new accounts and how we can use humour to deepen relationships as well. Essentially, the structure of building humour into our presentations and a whole lot more. So with that said, let's jump right into the show. Why is humour such a good and useful tool to build and to become known and liked and trusted? Is this a human thing? Is this relatable to everywhere? And kind of why does all this pull together? Because it seems like humour can be at the centre of those three things.
Yeah. And it is a question I get asked a lot. And because there is a fair bit of resistance to humour in a business context because people think, that's what I do out of business. But it all comes down to our evolutions. Our brains have evolved. Our brains are hardwired to separate everyone we meet into them and us. And so we separate everyone we meet and we decide this very quickly, whether that person is a them or that person is an us. And that all comes down to about 10, 20,000 years ago when our brains evolved, our tribes maxed out at about 200 people. And so that's all hardwired inside us that when we meet somebody new, we're a bit wary of them and our brains see them as a them rather than us. And we've got this little list of people inside our brains that we consider to be an us, and they're people we trust. But if I can get you laughing at things like a shared frustration or a common enemy and that sort of thing, then all of a sudden our brain stops seeing you as being on the other side of the desk. And instead, like we're arm in arm like this, and we're both laughing at that thing over there. And so all of a sudden, our brain very quickly starts to see the person talking to them as an us, because they're like, they're just like me. They share some of the same opinions I do. So there's that type of thing. So you're very quickly jumping across the desk and laughing at that same thing together, but also it very, very quickly, when somebody has made you absolutely bust a gut laughing, your brain is absolutely flooded with these feel-good neurochemicals, serotonin and dopamine and all these things that all of a sudden your defenses all get dropped down and they say this is also to do with our 10,000 years ago when we lived in tribes and laughter happened around the campfire when we all felt really safe. So if you can get people laughing very quickly, there's that all of a sudden they're one of us and I can drop my guard. This is a really safe moment. This is a pleasant thing that I can just drop my guard, be here in the moment and start to enjoy myself. And so those two things very quickly, if you can get somebody laughing and we can talk about targets for laughter later on if you like, if you can get somebody laughing, people's guard comes down and they start to see you as one of them. And I was saying a minute ago that in business there's a lot of resistance to this, but it's this funny dynamic because if you go on, eHarmony, RSVP, all those dating websites and that sort of thing, and have a look, what's the number one thing everybody says their prospective life partner simply must have? GSOH, good sense of humor. We choose the partner we want to spend the most time with. Something that everybody says is a criteria that what they simply must have is a good sense of humor. And psychologists have worked out one of the reasons for this is that someone who laughs a lot, particularly someone who's quite capable of laughing at themselves a lot, that shows they're very psychologically healthy. They've got a fair bit of inner peace going on. And so they're safe to hang around. And so again, there's that thing of, because when doesn't matter how good a saleswoman, salesperson you are, there's that tension in the sales process. There's that, there's that, that sneaky understanding underneath it all. They're trying to get my money, like in the conversation, there's a prize between these two people, and you're the salesperson and they've got the prize and you're trying to get the prize. And so there's that tension because they're trying to, all right, I know they're going to try and talk me into it. There's this undercurrent. Whereas if you can get them very quickly laughing, all those things that I just talked about, all those barriers come down and they start to see you as someone they can know, like, and trust very, very quickly.
So all that makes complete sense, Marty. And we've all had this experience where we sit down next to someone and they get us laughing, and it's almost like a level of magnetism. We want to spend more time around that, probably because we've become addicted to their personality, very literally by the chemicals that are swirling around in our brains when we're hanging out with them. So why is it then, and we won't dwell on this, we'll just kind of set it up, but why is it then that the stereotype, not necessarily the used car salesperson, but of the B2B sales professional is some dude in a weird, ill-fitting suit or some woman in a power suit with a boring as heck PowerPoint presentation. Everyone else is on the phones, not paying attention to anything that's going on. Why is it that that's the stereotype, and probably the stereotype comes from the reality of things versus what we know intrinsically, which is people who are funny, relaxed, humorous to whatever level? We want to spend more time around those individuals than Barry in his terrible suit.
So I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, mate.
Why does that exist? Why is that a thing? Why does everyone seemingly be drawn into the corporate bullshit nonsense side of sales when, again, intrinsically we know from friends and family and people we meet and seeing the likes of yourself on TV or on stage that these individuals who are funny, open, authentic, we want to spend time with them and not the corporate kind of drone.
I mean, this is a massive topic of discussion that I talk about a lot, and it's not just in sales; it's just in business. Full stop. There's one theory about this that they believe that because the business world came from hand-me-down leadership structure from the military world and that sort of thing, that people just had that, the thing that the lower down you were, then the more you just shut up and did what you were told. And so that they, the people who rose to the top were the meanest and most obnoxious and just the most forceful personalities rather than the most engaging personalities. Like, for example, in I've forgotten the Maori word for it, the Maori New Zealander Indigenous people, the Maori word for leader is people weaver, not people leader. And they don't sit sort of on like on a hill overlooking the tribe. They sit in the middle of the tribe, and everyone is around them. And so there's that conversation about that. The whole corporate world is functions like the hierarchical military system because that's the only model that people had when business started to become big in the Industrial Revolution and that sort of thing. But it's also, that I think, and I've watched a few episodes of your show before, and if you do go in really hard and make those Donald Trump-esque win-lose deals and that sort of thing, you can make some sales very quickly. And so people just sort of, we tend to stick to what we know rather than delve more deeply into it and really study the sales process. And so I think that's the key to it, because if you do come in really hard, you will make some sales and you'll probably win, the monthly salesman of the month and that sort of thing for a little bit. But you won't make a really great career that makes you feel good inside and have that, be those absolutely marvelous salespeople who do it for life and do it really well and have people keep coming back to them to buy off them.
Got it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question you've answered 5 million times before on TV, radio, and everywhere else, and it would be a very short show if the answer is no. So, but I'll ask it you anyway. Can anyone learn, or not anyone, but can most people learn to be at least a little bit more funny than they are right now?
Yeah, that's because the question, the way it's usually phrased is, can anybody be funny? And I would say not everyone can be stand-up comedy level funny. It's just not within them to risk failure as often as stand-up comics do. And you sort of have to have a certain bulletproofedness to your personality to want to do stand-up. I quote my dad, who said, stand-up comedy is the perfect job in the world if you are genetically predisposed to be the class dickhead, which I was. But anyone can be funnier. And that's the key to it, because it's that old Billy Connolly joke that he delivered on Parkinson about the people, the two guys walking across the Serengeti, and there was a lion sort of trying to stalk towards them, and this one guy leans down, starts putting his runners on, and then the guy says, "What are you doing? You're never going to outrun a lion." He says, yeah. I don't have to, mate. I just have to outrun you. And that's what it is. Like, you don't have to be stand-up comedy level funny. In fact, you shouldn't even really try to be a better salesperson. It's more just about being funnier than the people you're up against, your competition in the marketplace and that sort of thing. Just being truly authentic to you funny, that it becomes more engaging and establishes rapport.
So we're going to touch on resilience towards the end of the show, but you mentioned something which is interesting here. For anyone who is perhaps listening to this episode to get riled up, or they're on the way to the office, they get riled up to make some cold calls and they're perhaps nervous of being rejected on the phone. How does being rejected on a phone call to someone that you don't really know, especially on a cold call, how is that versus bombing on a stand-up set in front of an audience? Just to give the audience, Sales Nation, a bit of context, that someone saying no on the phone probably isn't that big of a deal, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a big difference between, because in stand-up, you got to hit them with a punchline every 17 seconds, or they just throw beer bottles and chicken wings at you and that sort of thing. So, but I think one of the things that stand-up comics and salespeople, when you get them together, like stand-up comics and salespeople, when they get together, they share their biggest bombs, like they share their biggest rejections as like these badges of honor that we wear. And I think it's very, very, very similar when most of the time you're actually doing okay, but those stories, those cataclysmic bombing stories, are the ones that you share behind closed doors, in the sales people's equivalent of the green room, when you're having a chat in the pub with your friends in sales and that sort of thing. And I think that's you wear it as this happened to me and I'm still trucking. I'm still continuing on with this. So like that's a bit of a sign of how resilient you are to other people.
Perfect. Right. So let's get practical. Is there a structure to whether it's a joke or a structure that just transcends humor? Is there a starting point for us to start adding humor, whether it's a bit of theory, whatever it is, to be able to start adding humor to emails, to calls, to meetings or presentations? Is there a starting point that we need to kind of cover to make progress with this?
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm teaching people how to use humor in presentations, I use this pyramid structure, and up the very top is where you get to when, sort of stand-up comedy secrets and that sort of thing. But down the bottom is just funny stories you already tell socially. So the place I always get people to start is ask your friends, ask your family, ask your long-suffering partner to say, look, what are the 2 or 3 stories that I tell around a barbecue, over a dinner party, over a dinner table at a dinner party, those social gatherings that, when the bevies are flowing and the bonhomie is going very well. What's that story? What's that 1 or 2 stories that I tell that you roll your eyes and go, oh, God, he's telling the Star Wars story again. Here we go. And start with those. Because when you tell a story that you've told 30, 40, 50 times before, your shoulders go back, your face lights up, how to tell the story really well. And I teach people how to weave those stories into their presentation. So just, for example, a little bit of teaching for the people watching this, that when you've made somebody laugh, when you've made somebody really bust a gut laughing, like I was saying before, their brains are absolutely flooded with neurochemicals that make them adore you. When you're a stand-up comic, you always have people coming up to you after the gig saying, oh, you're fantastic, which is really nice. But more in the sales process, if you've just finished that story and you are the most charismatic person in the room because you've made the whole room laugh, phrases like, the reason I tell you that story is this, ... The lesson for all of us in that story is this, ... As long as what you say kind of makes sense, then they're going to believe what you say. If they're going to believe the message that you tell them is wrapped up inside that story. And people sometimes push back on this, but I say, if you asked 100 people what is the moral of the Three Little Pigs, or what is the moral of Red Riding Hood, there'd be about 30 or 40 different things that come out. And so as long as you tell a story and the what you tell them the moral of that story is afterwards, and you just make sure it's one of the points you're trying to make in your sales presentation. You tell them that the moral of that story is, when a decision is going to have long-term consequences, make sure you really pause and think it through. Make sure it's a salient sales point that you're trying to make, but just wrap it up in a really funny story, and use a funny story as a bit of the parting of the seas to get people through their defenses. See, and the reason I tell people to use stories is really important. Like a friend of mine, Kate Burr, who's a stand-up down here in Australia, is she says, if you're trying to be funny, don't tell jokes, because if you when you're telling a joke, the audience is well aware you're telling a joke. You're telling a joke, and that builds up tension in the room as to whether they find it funny, or they sort of feel obliged to laugh if the punchline, because you can tell when someone's telling a joke just from their tone of voice. I actually, when I was living in the UK, I was invited to go to the Norwegian Comedy Festival. Me and 3 other guys were the only English-speaking people at the comedy festival, and we went to the late-night comedy tent afterwards, and you could just hear from the tone of their voice where the setups and punchlines were. It's like, and you can tell where the punchline. So if you're telling jokes, that puts pressure on the audience to laugh, and then if they don't laugh, there's just that, oh, geez, where do we go from here? Whereas if you just tell a story that just happens to have a really funny punchline at the end, and you don't say, I've got a funny story for you, like, you just tell a story that ends up being really funny, all the pressure's off. And if that only gets a 6 out of 10 laugh that day, that's okay. If it gets a 9 out of 10 laugh that day, that's okay too. So use funny stories, and then explain why you've told that story afterwards, and make sure that one of the moral of your story is one of the really important points you're trying to win them over with. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And what is the answer is it depends, I'm sure, but what is the cadence of this over, say, a 30-minute presentation? Do we need to do this once at the beginning that sets everything else up and everything else goes seamingly? Is this you mentioned 17 seconds before for a stand-up? Do we need to be cramming in kind of punchlines every 17 seconds to keep people's attention once, I guess, we've set their expectations? Or is this a first and then end kind of memory that people have of us, and the middle can be the more boring stuff that we need to kind of fit in there to get the job done? What's the cadence of funny stories within a, say, 30 minutes presentation?
Yeah, fantastic question, mate. And this is really important for people to understand. You don't have to be stand-up comedy level funny to be the funniest salesperson they've ever seen. The bar is so low when it comes to the way normal salespeople behave. And so that's why I say, gather together 2 or 3 funny stories that you already tell socially, because, as you say, in a 30-minute sales presentation, one at the start, one at the end, one about 2/3 of the way through when their attention is starting to drop off, is all you need to do for them. And trust me, I've coached enough people in doing this that they come back and say, people say I'm the funniest salesperson they've ever seen. Like, I only told 3 stories in half an hour. Like, you really don't have to be side-splittingly funny every 17 seconds for people to see you as being really engaging, really natural, and really humanly funny.
And I think you were spot on there of, I'm not necessarily concerned about someone calling me the funniest salesperson they've ever seen, but engaging is something that I do really care about. And that probably translates just as well as being funny, right? If that makes sense. There's not just, you don't want to just be the clown in the room. You want to, as you said, punctuate things with a something at the end of it that makes it all make sense and pull it back together. How do we avoid being the clown? And I mean this from the perspective of not necessarily me. I was quite shy and introverted as a kid, But there were plenty of, to quote yourself, class dickheads that I knew as kids who are now adults and are still the class dickhead and are not particularly funny, and they're actually a bit annoying.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not saying that you should try to be the funniest salesman. It's more so what people don't get, and leaders don't get this in business. When I coach leaders in business about this as well, if you are seen as just as having a good sense of humour, and it's all about partly it's about the targets for the jokes and the stories you make, which we can talk about later, but if you are seen as having a good sense of humour, you're actually seen to be, it increases your perceived leadership skills. It increases your level of being competent at what you do and being credible at what you do. There was a great study done in the US where people rated their physician, like their doctor, but doctors with serious injuries, not just your GPs and that sort of thing, and people who rated their their physicians as having a good sense of humour, they were more likely to trust their diagnosis and more likely to carry out their instructions to get through their illness. So it's as long as you don't, as you say, just keep cracking jokes the whole way through. That's why I say to use stories, not crack jokes. And so just tell stories that just happen to have a funny punchline at the end, and that's where the humour comes from. And then, as you say, you tell one funny story, you explain why you told that story. The moral in this story for this situation is this, and then go on to your regular sales presentation just with a bit of a smile on your face. Even just with a bit of a smile on your face is enough to bring that good feeling through into the things that you're trying to teach them and explain to them.
So I've suffered from this phenomenon. You may not have been a professional at this, but I'm sure some of the audience will as well. I will tell a joke to my girlfriend, my partner, or a story. She'll laugh her head off. I know how to push her buttons, and I'm actually, surprisingly for the audience, who probably anyone who thinks I'm dry on this show, I can be absolutely hilarious, and she'll laugh her head off. And it might be that she's just that daft that everything hits that I say, but I could tell then the same story to someone else, and it just becomes a mess. And is this because I'm less confident in the way I'm telling it, because perhaps it's a new person I'm not used to, or I'm not as confident in relaying the story? Is it because once you've got that a little bit of know, like, and trust, you can perhaps be sillier, dafter, and take a different angle on things because there's that bit of relationship there already? What's the dynamic going on between the difference between I can tell one story in one location, everyone looks at me like an idiot, and I tell the same story to my brothers, my dad, my girlfriend, whoever it is, someone that knows me, and they find it, hysterical might be pushing it. They find it a little bit funny, at least.
Well, I think, mate, they all love you, and they're just, pretending for your sake.
Bullshitting me.
No, it really is. People who are in sync tend to laugh more.
What does that mean? What does it mean to be in sync with someone? Because this translates kind of sales and everything else. I think that's I don't want to just gloss over that. You said it kind of flippantly. What does it mean to be in sync with someone?
Well, in terms of people who feel comfortable in the presence of other people, they do tend to laugh more and laugh out loud more. But the great thing about it is when it comes to making a room full of people laugh, there was this great study that even if you just make 25% of the room laugh out loud, and it doesn't matter how small the crowd is, if you make 25% of the room laugh out loud, so even if you're just presenting to a board of 8 people or something like that, even if just a couple of them give a bit of a human beings are really social animals. And so even if you only make 25% of the room laugh audibly, everyone else in the room hears that laughter and their opinion of you goes up. So you don't have to be gut-bustingly funny and make the whole room burst into laughter for the effects that we've been talking about with respect to sales actually work. So you don't have to, be delivering that punchline or, the final idea of your story and be like, oh, geez, I hope this goes well, because you haven't put the pressure on and told them that this was going to be a really funny thing in the first place. You're just telling a story, and whatever laugh it gets, that's okay. It's okay with them, and therefore it should be okay with you. Like I know, when I'm doing a speaking gig, I've got these 3 slides of babies that I show at the start of my speech about, more funny, more money speech that I teach people how to use sales. And I know because the third photo is like a little baby putting the finger up like that. And I know if that gets a 8.5 out of 10 laugh, this is going to be a great speech. If that gets a 6 out of 10 laugh, it's like, ooh, I'm going to have to work for this one. And so don't put the expectations on it. Sometimes everyone's stories, everyone's jokes only get that, yeah.
Because the reason I asked that, and I think hopefully this is valuable for the audience, because this is something that I've learned over the years. I've had people come on the show, Marty, to talk about body language, for example, and we've talked about mirror neurons and when you kind of sit one way and you follow the person and you can lead them one way or another. And I always find manipulative is probably not the right word, because if you're doing it with good intentions, perhaps it's just influence. But they're all hacks. They're all little tips, techniques, and tricks almost. But when you said when people are in sync, people will laugh along with each other. This is almost top of the funnel stuff. If you can be funny, if you can build that know, like, and trust, you don't need to do all the weird stuff and techniques. All that comes along naturally. People will follow you and kind of fall in line. And the kind of data and the studies and people laughing or clapping or people standing up for an ovation. If one or two people stand up, people tend to stand up around them and join them. If no one stands up, or I'm not explaining this very well, but people follow the crowd, right? People are drawn to that herd mentality. If one person runs randomly at a venue away from something, people assume that there's a problem, and it causes massive problems with people getting crushed and all that kind of stuff. So we took a dark turn there for a second as I tried to make that point.
No, you're absolutely right, though, about it being top of funnel stuff that can make a lot of the techniques and the hacks less important to know about. If you can, and even and you can see this just on the internet. When you talk about top of funnel, loads of studies have shown, things that make us laugh are liked and shared about 2 or 3 times the rate of any other human emotion that it brings out. So just so getting noticed and, being trusted once you have been noticed, humor is such a powerful skill.
Cool. And so before we get on to resilience, because wrap up the show with that, Marty, something you mentioned here, to use your words, was you go into a room and you may have to work for it. You might have to work a little bit harder. From, again, the non-professional's perspective, what does that mean, and what does that look like if our first story gets a 4 out of 10? Do we eject from this conversation? Do we go back to corporate world and just carry on straight down the middle? Or is there anything that we can do to kind of ramp things up, get a bit more energy in the room? Assume we're presenting to 8 people around a desk or whatever it is, as opposed to 1,000 or 500 in a theatre. But what can we do to work the rooms, so to speak, if things aren't quite landing at first?
Sure. I mean, there's some techniques around telling stories for starters, you can just like when you're filming something for TV, your facial expressions can be quite small and quite nuanced. Whereas when you're on stage, a 1,000 seat theatre and that sort of thing, your smile has to be. You need bigger expressions, and so I have to tell myself my little mantra. I say, you're on stage, you're on stage, you're on stage. Like, so just like make your expressions bigger. And so if you're talking about being aggravated, you just like oh dear God, just really ham it up a little bit when you're telling the story, not necessarily afterwards. But there's one very quick tip I can give to people about telling stories. There's a whole heap of them in the more funny, more money stuff. But the best one to start with is replace narration with first-person present dialogue. So when you're telling a story, don't say, so then I got out of my car and I walked in and I said to the guy, hello, Steve. That's narration. I'm narrating the story. Whereas if I am performing the story, I do it in first-person present dialogue. And so firstly I say, so I'm getting out of my car and I walk in and I say, "G'day, Steve."
Sure.
So like I become the character. I become the person who is doing that at the time. And there's been loads of great psychological studies that show when we narrate the story in first person present dialogue, the person listening to it, when you hear a story, there's a thing called the referential shift that happens. So like you and I are looking at each other. I'm looking at my my webcam up on my computer and a little picture of you down below that. And, you know, the people watching this are looking at their computers at a screen at you and I talking. But if I started telling you a story I was on a train about 3 days ago, and I walked in and it was sort of one of those trains where you walk down a little bit, and then I sat down, and this guy came and sat next to me, and I straight away thought, or might be a bit of a nutter, because this guy sat next to me. He had this bright blue jacket on, a bright yellow shirt, bright green trousers, and bright red shoes, and I thought, oh no, this might not end well. Now, for the record, that is a totally fictitious story. But in your head, you stopped seeing Marty Wilson talking to you and you pictured a man wearing a blue coat, a yellow, and you pictured that person.
Mm-hmm.
You stopped being here in the present with me, and your brain started to very quickly picture. That's called a referential shift, where you jump into the story and start picturing what's going on in that story. Our brains do this automatically for us. That's why people go along and see Lord of the Rings and go, well, what, Sauron didn't look like that? That's ridiculous. Because when we read a book, we imagine how all these things work. That's the power of stories. And so people get out of, and this works much better when you use first-person present narration instead of just first-person present dialogue rather than narrating the story. So get into the story and practice. You've got to rehearse your stories.
And how do you rehearse a story? This seemingly such a simple question, but this is something that I've asked people when we've talked about sales presentations, for example, and people have different thoughts and views on it, whether you should do it and record it and view yourself back, whether you should do it to an audience, whether you just do it in the mirror. How do you practice a comedic story? Because clearly, just as you were telling that story then, I was getting engrossed because of the facial expressions, the pace. I noticed there was a bunch of pauses and different things going on that's, subtly, you either kind of such a pro that you're doing it unconsciously or you're consciously putting them all in. How do we practice all of that so that we can start to refine these perhaps 2 or 3 stories that we know that go down well at the local barbecue?
There's a couple of different parts of this. There's firstly, I would strongly encourage people to type it out or write it out or, dictate it and send it into, rev.com or all those services that transcribe things, and then consciously craft it, consciously craft it first. So deliberately choose to, okay, here, right, I've got to turn that into dialogue, so I'll become that guy there. And then so consciously craft the story and then leave it for 2 or 3 days and go back and edit it. And then email it to yourself and edit it on your phone, because you look at things differently when you're editing things on your phone than you do when you're reading it on a bit of paper. But beat it on a bit of paper, get the red pen out. So craft it first and then really annoy your friends by practicing it socially. Like seriously, like when I was doing stand-up full time, my then girlfriend, now wife, would just roll her eyes like after I'd been going for about 4 or 5 minutes at a party, and she's like, "Yes, he's doing material at you. He's trying out new material on you," and that sort of thing. But so you have to practice it in front of a crowd, and so just get your friends and say, "Look, I'll buy you dinner if I can do 2 or 3 new stories at you," and consciously choose to do that. And do things like I go for a walk in the local park that's over there, just with my phone earpiece in so that people don't think I'm nuts, and just walk around yeah, and gesticulate like I would on stage, because when you're in a public place, it's all very well to do it, alone here in my little studio or that sort of thing. But when you're in a public place, you walk past someone walking a dog, that sort of thing, your brain gets that little bit distracted like you are when you are presenting to a room full of people and that type of thing. So lots of different ways. Practice it with friends, practice it with your earpiece in the park. But the first thing is to really take the time, because these are going to be your signature stories, we call them in the speaking trade, that, really set up your sales presentation. So it's worthwhile spending just an hour crafting it properly before you do.
We've covered storytelling on the show a bunch of times. We've covered sales presentations and demos countless times, probably 50, 60 times now throughout the 700 shows that we've got in the bag here on the Salesman Podcast. No one, Marty, other than yourself, has said, we use rev.com for our transcriptions. It's like $1 a minute, super cheap. No one has said, transcribe your story, the beginning of your pitch, if we're not talking about humor, perhaps, whatever it is, and then refine it on a page or on your phone or wherever you want to kind of spend time. No one has ever said that. And that's probably the difference between an amateur doing this and a pro, right? That's what the pro does versus the hack. That's the differentiator here, isn't it?
Oh, thank you, mate. I love Ernest Hemingway said the first draft of anything is shit. But he also said write drunk, edit sober. so what a guy.
Yeah.
What a guy. It's particularly when you're going to earn your living from these stories. I've got a really good opening story for my More Funny, More Money keynote and a really great closing story. And so, I earn my living from those stories being remembered and those stories, people telling that story. So when the other thing I forgot to mention is when you have a great sales story that makes a great point, people tell that story to other people and people talk about you. And so they're passing on word of mouth about you, and they'll probably tell the moral of that story after they've done it and go, wow, I need to talk to that guy. I need to talk to that girl. People are spreading the word about your expertise or the thing you are selling. So it's worth putting in a little bit of effort to make sure that those stories are really crystal clear. And, you look at, I'm trying to think of shows, you look at like shows like The Office or, Brooklyn Nine-Nine's very big in Australia here at the moment. Or if you look back over like shows like Friends and those sort of shows, when you watch shows that are, seem like they are effortlessly funny, not one word, not 1 ounce of airtime is wasted. Like every word in those shows is either a setup or a punchline. There's nothing in there that's because airtime is really expensive, so there's nothing in there that's wasted. So take the time to do that, not for your whole presentation, but just for those crucial 1.5 minute stories that you're going to tell. It makes such a difference.
Yeah, I know The Office, the US Office in particular, one of my favorite shows of all time. You only have to look at the fact that it's not aired in years, and the internet is full of clips, memes, people re-quoting it, like Anchorman, the Anchorman films. There's so many one-liners and setups and punchlines, as you described in them, that it's constantly being recycled, and it's almost it becomes part of the zeitgeist eventually. So if you can do, clearly we're aiming quite high to be on that kind of front, the Ron Burgundy kind of level of comedy, but if we're a few steps below that, you do become viral within accounts. And if someone comes in and you go to tender, so when I was selling here in the NHS, selling to the NHS here in the UK, we go to tender, there'd be 8 presentations back to back. Now, clearly I wasn't funny then, I'm not particularly funny now, but if you could differentiate yourself in any way by wearing pink socks or whatever it was, immediately you just stand out, because the people who you're dealing with, if they don't know, like, and trust you, if you don't already have that in the bag, which is clearly the goal before you go in the presentation to do the tender presentation is to have that nailed. If you don't have that, you just got to do anything, walk in naked, whatever it is, and at least they can consider you, other than just another dude, another woman in a suit, right?
Yeah. And as long as that's, with respect to sales, as long as if it was appropriate to your presentation or made a valid point about walking in naked, if you could somehow make it that, you could, if you had the chutzpah, the balls to do that, and then get in there and say, you need to understand every single patient who comes into your hospitals feels as fragile and exposed as I feel right now, or something like that. If you can make a point with that thing that you've also used to stand out, that's when you become truly memorable.
Well, I used to sell to urologists, but I don't think my willy is as impressive enough to kind of go in and use that as a leading part of a sales pitch. But with that, Marty, I'm nervous today. That's a sight that the audience don't want to we won't go into first person for that story. They don't want to be imagining that. Well, that, Marty, I did want to cover resilience. We've not got time. I will have you back on with open arms to discuss that in the not too distant future, mate, if you're up for it. Because I think that's probably a whole topic on itself. But with that,
absolutely, just the the scientific evidence behind being able to laugh at things that are stressing you out is massive. I'd love to come back on.
Good. Well, we've got you on camera saying that now, so we'll hold you to it. With that, Marty, I've got one final question, mate. It's something that I ask everyone that comes on the show. So I know you're not a quote-unquote salesperson, but you'll definitely have an insight on this. And that is, if you could...
I am. Everyone is.
If you could go back in time, mate, and speak to your younger self, and you could give him one piece of advice that would help him become better at selling, which has nothing to do with humour, what would that one piece of advice be?
Be human. Just be human about it. And in terms of, and when I say that, I mean understand how they are feeling first and put them at ease.
And is this something that you know and have always known intrinsically, or is that a lesson you've learned? Because I feel a lot of people, especially in sales, when you start, need to learn that lesson.
Yeah, no, I think everyone, when you first start getting into selling things, you know, I sell my speaking now. I teach speakers how to sell speaking better in an online course that I sell and that sort of thing. So anytime you're selling, the temptation is like, I've got this, I do this, me, I'm awesome. When in fact it really should always come back to that lovely quote. Oh, I've forgotten who said it now, but enter the conversation that's already happening in your prospects' minds. You know, like that's where you should start. Start thinking about where is their head at and how can I meet them there first. And because I have to do that when I'm giving speeches at conferences and things like that. In the very first, 2 minutes of that's where the baby photo comes into it. Like that's how they're probably feeling looking up at me. How many people in the room are feeling like this little baby like that, and that always gets the biggest laugh because it totally busts the idea that I'm this motivational speaker coming in telling you how to live your life and that sort of thing. So it's start in the place where they are with their problems and their resistance to your solutions.
Good stuff. Well, we've touched on the book. For everyone who wants to learn a little bit more about you, tell us where we can find that. And then tell us about the speaking as well, because clearly you're crushing it in that space. And I know there's a bunch of people listening who might be interested in learning more about that of you, Marty.
Yeah, sure. If you'd like to learn how to add humour to your presenting, go to morefunnymoremoney.com. There's a book, bestseller on Amazon. You can buy there, teaching people. So first half's all about the why, and the second half is about the how to use humour. And there's online programs and that sort of thing. And I speak on that. If you'd like to get me to come along and speak at your conference, just go to martinwilson.com. Martinwilson.com is my speaking website where you can see, me on telly showing off and that sort of thing.
Good stuff. Well, I'll link to all that in the show note to this episode over at salesman.org. And with that, Marty, it's been a real pleasure, mate. I genuinely enjoyed chatting with you, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Will.